Well, good morning. It's really happy to be here with everybody today. When Lauren asked me to talk about religious liberty, I realized that a lot of times people will give a bird's eye view of all the religious liberty issues, and it gets really complex and cumbersome. And this time I decided I'm going to focus on a very narrow issue of free speech. And as I developed the issue and studied it, I realized that almost all religious liberty issues involve free speech. So we're once again at a larger scale conversation, but my goal today is to really discuss these concepts in a way that is not only informative about the rules involving free speech and what to expect, but also sort of neutral in terms of actual content and focusing more on the basic concepts behind the freedom of speech. I'm an attorney, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a pastor. And so I'm used to being able to talk for about 5 seconds before somebody objects and interjects with their own question or comment. So feel free to interrupt me. I welcome it because it helps keep me on track. And I look forward to our interaction here today.
Just so you know, Michael, generally speaking, most people will hold their comments until they've you're through unless you ask a question. That's kind of been our not that they
Okay.
can't, but usually they don't.
Okay, well, that's fine. However you want to do it. Well, I'll get going, and I'm sure that some things, the thing about religious liberty subjects is they are by far the most controversial subjects that we can discuss. And when you come up to free speech issues, they are also some of the most complex issues and controversial issues that we can discuss. And so I'm sure there'll be a lot of feelings going around, and especially in almost, I was looking and saying, well, this freedom of speech has been a big issue, one of the major issues in American politics and world politics for almost every year since the country began to exist. And how do you approach the issue? What do you do about it? How do you get people talking together? One of the fundamental things in our principles in Founders First Freedom, which I'm going to discuss really briefly, is getting people to talk together. I did want to give a plug for my website, um, religiousliberty.tv. It's actually run by the organization Founders First Freedom, which is a nonprofit. We started the blog in June of 2008, primarily online on as a website, and more recently, within the last year or so, we've been transitioning to our Substack. I would really invite you to subscribe to the Substack. You can do so for free. If you do decide to donate something to it, that money goes straight to the organization. It doesn't go to me personally, but it sort of just keeps the lights on when it comes to our online thing. But the it's a labor of love for me. It's a one of the things I felt was missing within Adventism and within the larger world was an objective view of cases as they come out. Almost every day there is another lawsuit being filed and there's court decisions being rendered. And most of the time, the results of the decisions are filtered through the media and bloggers and different people who all have a certain viewpoint on it. And my goal is to try to hit it objectively and to talk about here's what the case says and maybe put a little commentary at the end. But I want people to be able to understand how the law works and what to expect when they have cases that come up that we may not be commenting on in the future. Um, one of the things that is interesting, or some people aren't, is that in law school you get about 2 months of education on the First Amendment in one class. So that's about 2 months of 1 hour a day for 5 days a week. Let's say it's 40 hours of education on First Amendment stuff. And that's really it. And you learn a few of the cases and you learn some of the basic concepts. If you take the time to spend 15 minutes a day reading about religious liberty, reading about the constitutional law, you'll have an understanding of the issues that is as large as any attorney's and can analyze the issues for yourself. There's no magic conferring of education on us when it comes to these issues when we pass the bar. And, we're obviously out there litigating on these matters. So if you understand the core principles of how these things work, then it will really help you in the future understanding how cases come up, and you don't have to rely on somebody else for how to get that. One of the things we talked about like this week, October 6th, was the Commerce Clause. Uh, and a lot of times people glaze over when they hear the words the Commerce Clause. So I try to make it accessible and understandable. That's one of our new features we're going to be talking about. We're adding on is sort of a classroom section to discuss uh, basic concepts in the law and how they interact with religious liberty. Another thing that we do is we are sponsoring a series of programs with Pepperdine University, and they used to have an organization called the Newt Institute. And about 10 years ago, they were having these big conferences at Pepperdine, and then just before COVID, they started getting smaller and smaller and then disappeared. And so we thought, we need to really get that going again because it would bring in scholars from around the country and even internationally who are the key people when it comes to issues of constitutional law. There's a small fraternity of constitutional law attorneys who do First Amendment work, and I'd say maybe 200 to 300 people. And so as you look at the scholarship and you look at the people making the arguments at the court, the same names will come up over and over. So we've made it a point to kind of bring them in. And so this was in 2023. We had a big conference on campus at Pepperdine. We had two former U.S. Solicitor Generals in attendance. We had several judges. We had law professors from around the country. And we had a really good turnout. Probably had probably 100 people there altogether. And it was really a good opportunity for people who disagree with each other on these issues to discuss them. It's not uncommon in our conferences to have attorneys who have argued both sides in front of the Supreme Court on key issues on cases that you may have heard of, and who've written the amicus briefs and argued both sides strenuously. And then they come together in the conference to discuss sort of how these issues are coming out. So it's one of the most exciting things to be involved in because they're the people making the news. This was actually, it was a 2024 conference. We had Noel Francisco, who is the Solicitor General under Donald Trump, and we had Donald Verrilli, who is the Solicitor General under Obama. And so both of them did a co-presentation the first night of the conference. And it was very interesting because they talked about sort of what it is like being a Solicitor General. And if you don't know what that is, they're essentially the president's attorneys in front of the Supreme Court. So when we had, and they present the perspective of the administration when these issues are being argued. A few years ago, we had a Sabbath accommodation case that we wanted to have heard in front of the Supreme Court. And our organization wrote an amicus brief on it. And the Supreme Court asked Noel Francisco to weigh in on it as to whether or not they should hear that case. And so he wrote a report. The court decided not to hear that particular case, but then the following year, they heard the Groff versus DeJoy case, which was on a very similar issue, which was actually a stronger case to bring forward. And we were able to secure Sabbath accommodation. We wrote an amicus brief for it. There are other attorneys who argued the issues, but it was really a really big event. And so it was really nice to be able to discuss these issues in a small group setting with some of the attorneys who are presenting them in front of the court. My perspective on this stuff is that when you are, it's one thing to sit in the background and discuss issues with people back and forth on the internet or whatever. It's another thing to actually be in the arena talking to the people who are going to make the arguments in front of the courts and to be able to provide some perspective. So building those relationships is extremely important to us. This year, actually, in June, we had a conference in Switzerland where we had we had two Circuit Court of Appeals judges there from the Fifth and the Ninth Circuit, as well as justices from the European Court of Human Rights and several international courts in Europe. And we also had attorneys who had argued both sides of some of the major issues that were going in front of the Supreme Court. in the US. So it was a really interesting chance to compare and contrast European law with American law and to discuss some of these issues that were coming up. One of the keynote presentations was by Sam Brownback, who was a former US Senator, and he was talking about his passion for working on international human rights in Africa, where they're dealing with some major problems with people being persecuted. Other members of our organization are, you may know Walter Carson and Steve Allred, and Kent Hansen is also on our board. Steve and Wally were with us in Switzerland. The picture at the bottom there is Pepperdine's campus at Switzerland. One thing about Pepperdine is whenever they have a presentation or conference or anything, they always take pictures of their buildings because one of them is in Malibu on the beach. And then this is the campus in Switzerland, opened about 2 years ago. So we were really happy to be able to have our meetings there. It went for about 4 days, and it was a blast being able to talk about American law with British court justices. We had several people from the High Court in Britain who were also there. And I had an interesting conversation with one of them about what they thought about the American Revolution. And his answer was, well, we don't think about it much. We just kind of move on, and it wasn't a big deal to us. We were happy to let him go. Too much to administer. So I really, the reason why I'm bringing this up is I wanted to show that there's truly an interest in discussion across the barriers, across the lines, making sure that you have the ability to talk to people, not just cutting people off because they may disagree with you politically. So there's an old saying that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's something that kids tell each other. But the reality is, words are powerful, and I think we need to start with an acknowledgement of that fact. Um, we'll talk a little bit about verbal acts. There's certain things you can actually say that count as actions in the courts. They're not just considered words, they're considered actions. So, from a biblical perspective, the entire Bible starts with words. God spoke and creation obeyed. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Words having physical and moral authority is a core concept throughout the Bible. And they can carry weight, they can shape reality, and influence hearts and minds in profound ways. Uh, you know, I it wasn't long ago that if you wanted to have a conversation and be able to reach millions of people in the world with what you wanted to say, you had to go through an audition process, buy thousands of dollars worth of equipment, and somehow get airtime in order to proclaim whatever you wanted to talk about. And today, we have people who are sitting on the toilet making comments that are heard around the world, arguing with somebody else who's sitting on the toilet. So the reality is, words have changed tremendously in the last few years. And, you can be sitting in the middle of the night, you think of something, you post it online, and suddenly you're in big trouble. Somebody's going to read that, and it is, everybody's on the stage now. Everybody can be on the stage if you want to be on the stage. And the default position for most people right now is to be on that stage. You sort of have to opt out of being involved socially on the internet. And so the idea that words are powerful is no longer just, they're powerful for the people who have that platform. They are powerful for every single person on the face of the earth who has the ability to communicate with everybody else on the face of the earth. The weirder you are, the more likes you get, the more exposure you get. So you end up with people who have really strange views taking all the oxygen in the room, while people who are more moderate are sitting by quietly watching it happen. And that's another aspect that's really kind of, I think, changed the world. Um, you end up with people on the extremes who are getting all the attention, and everybody else who's sort of like, wants to get along to go along, is in the middle, and they may or may not respond to those things. So anyway, words are powerful. Uh, Human speech has ability to build or destroy. So and when we talk about verbal acts, the judge can say, I sentence you to 5 years in prison. That's a verbal act that turns directly into physical power. You can have a word that says, you have a couple that says, I do, and those can change the world as far as that couple is concerned, or maybe everybody around them. My daughter is in high school, and she was talking about a couple who broke up. And I don't know, I was talking to her and I said, you know what? I said, she said, oh, it seems like it's a real big deal to them. And I said, well, of course it's a big deal. You have this couple in ninth grade who are dating each other. I don't know, they're dating each other. And when they break up, the entire space-time continuum changes. There are thousands of people who will be affected down the line because they broke up. You have no idea. Yes, it's absolutely a big deal. The course of human history may change for good or for bad because the couple broke up. Uh, you know, I kind of, I don't know if she fully appreciated what I said. Kind of took her idea and just kind of expanded it into infinity, which is fun to do for a little while. But by saying something, we do something. Um, Words are creative. So we get down to the First Amendment. Now remember, First Amendment, no telephones, nothing. If you wanted to say something, you had to write a letter, and then other people had to read it and maybe print it out a few times for other people to read it. But Congress said, the First Amendment said, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. When it comes to religious freedom, we usually focus on the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. But the Free Exercise Clause is pretty much dependent on the freedom of speech. If you're exercising a religion, a lot of times that now has to do with, well, I'm exercising my free speech. So when you go to court, you may argue both for the free exercise of religion and also for a free speech argument to try to bolster your claim. And that both free speech and faith need to be protected from government coercion. And this recognizes that conscience and expression are intertwined aspects of human dignity. And it's a space for conscience. If you think of the New Testament, Jesus says, if you think a certain way, it's as if you did it. If you hate your brother, it's as if you actually murdered them. If you know, look lustfully after somebody, it's as if you actually committed adultery. The idea of words actually, for a Christian, can actually not even have to translate in actual speech, but be conscience that is not expressed out to the outside world. It gets pretty like a big idea. Anyway, there's the marketplace of ideas and why the free speech matters. There's a marketplace of ideas. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and you may remember, it's kind of cold and hot in terms of some of his decisions that he made. But his idea was that the best test of truth is for it to be accepted in the marketplace. Of course, that's kind of the idea that you have a consensus that everybody's going to generally agree on something, or scientific consensus, and people agree on that, therefore it must be true. It's a practical test, but it doesn't necessarily recognize the right of minorities or other people who may see things differently, but may not have passed the threshold of having a majority agree with them. It's also necessary for a democratic self-governance. Citizens in a democracy have to be free to discuss public affairs, criticize government, and advocate for change. Without robust speech protection, self-governance becomes impossible. That's an issue that, of course, is very pertinent today. If you're going to discuss something, you want to know that you're safe in discussing it and that the government isn't going to crack down on you. It's also essential to individual autonomy, such as human dignity and self-fulfillment, and to be able to develop your own thoughts, express your identity, and participate fully in society as an individual. If you're unable to do those things, you sort of, are you in complete fulfillment of who you are, or are you being suppressed in some way? It's also a check on power. It's a safeguard against tyranny and abuse of power. And It lets people who like whistleblowers, journalists, and citizens expose wrongdoing and hold authorities accountable. One interesting thing about that is whoever is in power or whoever's not in power says, hold people accountable, blow the whistle. And then when they get in power, they're like, don't let them talk. They're wrong. Suppress what they're saying. And it goes both ways. These concepts of freedom of speech, by the way, are principles that kind of stand regardless of who is in office. As soon as you start saying, well, we're in power, therefore other people don't have any more power, that's a big problem. These are rights and privileges and ideas that need to be available to everybody, regardless of who is in governing power. And that's a danger that we've seen go back and forth over time. And it seems to be accelerating and becoming more and more severe. I wanted to talk about a couple of myths of free speech. Uh, there's the idea of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And whenever somebody says something that's kind of inflammatory and somebody says, well, you shouldn't say that because it's like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The reality is the that was often used to justify speech restrictions, but that case was ultimately overturned. People have the right to say things as long as you are not engaging in a verbal act causing immediate physical harm. So, and that goes along with this idea of hate speech. Well, let me put it this way: if you say, "Look, I am," um, the idea of fire in a crowded theater came up a lot during COVID, where people said, "Well, you can't talk against this medication because you're like yelling fire in a crowded theater, and if you tell people they shouldn't take the vaccine, then you are actually creating a physical danger to them." And there were efforts to try to curtail that kind of speech. The reality was that that kind of speech is constitutionally protected. Person doesn't have to believe it, and the way to get around it is to ultimately overcome it with actual facts or try to convince them otherwise. I see there's a question here from Linda. I see a raised hand here.
Yes, let me,
Oh,
uh,
I
Linda,
meant to
did you,
I meant to raise
are
it
you,
early for the end of the conversation. I didn't mean to
okay,
raise it,
all
but
right,
I still want to.
not a problem, Linda. You can just keep your hand up and you'll be first in line when we get there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Another myth is that hate speech is not protected. And there are certain countries in the world where hate speech is vigorously prosecuted, including in the UK. I've heard that there are thousands of people who are arrested every year for things they say on social media that are perceived as hate speech. But in the United States, there is no prosecution for hate speech. There can be other consequences of it, but you're not going to go to jail for it. And the ACLU has actually vigorously upheld the idea of free speech, even if it is objectionable. Uh, there are policy reasons that can go both ways on that issue, but I'll leave that there for right now. We can come back to it. Another thing is free speech means no consequences. You see protesters who will, you know, throw a brick at a car, break windows and stuff, and they'll say, "That's my free speech, and I'm exercising my right to protest." Well, that doesn't mean they're immunity from consequences. You can yell and shout all you want, but the minute you throw a brick through somebody's window, you can be prosecuted for that. You're committing vandalism, you're engaging in something very physical. But it could also be consequences like if you say something that's completely objectionable, you may lose your job as a result. You can lose opportunities as a result, or scholarships, or things like that. There can be private consequences. One thing that people don't always fully appreciate is the First Amendment only applies to actions of the government. And mechanically, the way that works is the First Amendment applied primarily to actions of the federal government, and it was expanded by the 14th Amendment to apply to acts by state governments through the Due Process Clause. The idea is that freedom of speech is not the same as freedom from disagreement. You can say things and people may disagree with you, people may not like it or whatever, but you have the right to speak. You don't have the right to make somebody listen to you. You don't have the right to, tie somebody up in a chair and have them listen to your long speech about whatever. But you can speak. No audience, no guarantee of an audience. But it also doesn't mean that you can shut down somebody just because you don't like what they said. The option is to just walk away. I would. There are certain areas like captive audience issues and like it's in schools and things like that where it comes to prayer in school and things like that where there may be freedom of speech, but there's also the captive audience idea, and a person may not be able to. There are limited forums for that type of thing. So there's tension. There's a tension between, for free speech, there's free speech and there's religious liberty. We've talked about individual autonomy, marketplace of ideas, human dignity, equal protection, and maintaining civic peace and preventing speech that incites violence or hatred is something that people are going to normally want to be attracted to. Just because somebody has a freedom of speech doesn't mean you have to facilitate it. So constitutional rights don't exist in isolation. Almost every issue, by the way, when it comes to religious liberty, has a tension with it. And over the years, those tensions have become more pronounced. We'll talk about one case a little bit later where a person's religious freedom right to not participate in something they found morally objectionable was in tension with this law that required non-discrimination on those issues. So there is tension, and there's always going to be tension. And the idea is to figure out ways to work through that kind of tension. Okay, this was, I don't want to take up too much time on some of these cases, but this was the fire in a crowded theater case. The Supreme Court at that point was addressing a case where the secretary of the Socialist Party had been distributing pamphlets telling men to resist the military draft. And it was arguing that conscription violated the 13th Amendment's prohibition against involuntary servitude. If you read that, though, there's actually an exception within the 13th Amendment. But anyhow, he was convicted under the law, and the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, saying that speech could be restricted if it posed a clear and present danger to national security. So this guy's going around telling people, don't sign up for the draft. And they arrest him and say, you can't tell people that. And the Supreme Court agreed with that. And that was overruled later on because this had to do with dissension during wartime. There's a lot of that kind of dissension going on now with ICE raids and things like that. And if the government simply said, look, you can't tell people not to comply with this, that may be found unconstitutional in the current law. Brandenburg was the new test where they talked more about what this kind of speech involved. And this involved a KKK leader in Ohio who had been convicted for advocating violence during a televised KKK rally. Can you imagine a televised KKK rally today? Be an interesting concept, but who knows what's going to happen. But anyway, they came up with something called the Brandenburg test, which is that speech is protected unless it incites imminent lawless action and is likely to produce such action. So simply telling people don't register for the draft is not enough. It has to actually incite imminent lawless action. And that is now currently the standard for evaluating whether something is incited today. And it does protect even offensive and hateful speech unless it directly and immediately incites illegal activity. You may think of a recent situation in which inciting illegal activity became a core issue in a situation. But the idea of that is pretty strenuous. You have to be able to demonstrate the person said, go do this, break the law right here, and engage in this lawless action. So if you're inciting people, telling people, hey, here's some matches, burn down a building, that would be inciting imminent lawless action. But saying, hey, I know if somebody could, might do that, it may not be. But, when on all these issues, by the way, don't act on what I'm saying. Talk to your lawyer before you decide to tell somebody to burn a building down. Uh, please don't do that. I'm not giving any legal advice today. This is just a conversation about what could happen and some of the things that have happened in the past. There's a Tinker versus Des Moines case where the three students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. School officials suspended them, fearing the armbands would cause disruption, and the students and their families sued, arguing that their First Amendment rights were violated. And the court ruled 7-2 in favor of them. This is in 1969, saying students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. And this case, by the way, Tinker versus Des Moines, is the key case that's being discussed right now when they're talking about student protests on university campuses. There's a difference between blocking students from attending something and physically engaging, and another thing to just be protesting something, which is what these students were doing to protest the Vietnam War. But that's an important case to keep in mind because it sort of lays out the principle for how the court approaches this. There's RAV versus City of St. Paul. By the way, if I was teaching this in a law school, the way you do it is you'd have the students read the cases before the seminar, and then the teacher just asks them questions about the case. So the students respond with all the case information. So, but today I'm just going to kind of go over these and briefly talk about what these cases say, instead of trying the Socratic method. But anyway, this is a case where in 1992, a teenager burned a cross on the law of a black family's home in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the city prosecuted him under an ordinance that banned placing symbols, including burning crosses, that could arouse anger, alarm, or resentment based on race, color, creed, religion, or gender. Now, was this kid obnoxious? Of course. Was this something that you'd want your kid doing? Hopefully not. But how broad a ruling could that be if the city could just say, look, I find your religious symbol offensive. It's going to make me upset at you. I mean, a cross on a church could also, incite some anger. Of course, putting it on somebody else's house is probably another problem, which would be vandalism, which I think is probably, more legally cognizable way of addressing this issue. But the Supreme Court held that the law engaged in viewpoint discrimination by prohibiting speech based on the specific message conveyed that violated the principle of content neutrality required by the First Amendment. Now, one thing is, if this kid got fired from his job because he did this, he would not have those same rights that he would have under the law from being prosecuted for it. Okay, so that's a very important decision to make, or distinction to make. He could not go to jail for it, but he could lose his job. He could be kicked out of school for it, and face other kinds of ramifications for doing something like this. But as far as government action goes, there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment in the United States. Even deeply offensive and repugnant expression is protected from government censorship. So the government can't ban speech simply because it is a hateful idea or provokes anger. Now, let's say he worked for the government as worked for the Parks and Recreation Department. They may have some clauses within their employment contracts that would also allow him to be fired for that action. But putting him in jail is a thing that would not be permitted under the law for that activity. Although, again, there are ancillary issues. There's also, I would assume there'd be an implicit threat to the people whose house he put it on, and there could be threats of violence. There are a lot of other ways to probably find ways to prosecute that kind of behavior, but the act of the speech itself may not be under that case. So you'll see that one of the things that's kind of disturbing about free speech law in America is that it's largely been shaped by the KKK cases. Because they're kind of the most objectionable, offensive organization, and their cases make it to the top because everybody gets mad about them. get in trouble. So one of the, when it comes to constitutional law, it's usually the outlier extreme organizations that sort of set the standard in terms of what is going to happen. Uh, you don't see a lot of cases in the United States where, let's say he put an Adventist, or let's say he walked up to a person's house and he went to a Catholic's house and he put a great controversy on their porch and walked away. Would that be considered hate speech under this kind of law? That's a gentler example, but to some people they may say, "Oh, you called the Pope the Antichrist. You've sort of, been extremely offensive to us. That's wrong." But if the court's going to say, "Look, you can go as far as burning a cross on somebody's yard, and it's not counted as a um, we can't, it's not counted as a free speech, exceeding the rights of free speech, even though you have other issues with it. There's some area for freedom underneath that. But I also think that as we go along, there will be more and more cases where a person engaging in otherwise innocuous behavior may face some kind of prosecution or ramifications for their actions. If I mean, we're on the, these all depend on elections, like which way they go, depending on how these kind of laws change. Because one thing that is clear about the courts is that they do change over time. Things can change. So nothing we're talking about today is definitely set in stone, even if it is a Supreme Court decision. So this is not Barry Black, the Adventist chaplain, by the way, in case you're wondering. This is a different guy. In Virginia versus Black. He led a KKK rally where a cross was burned. Virginia law banned cross burning with the intent to intimidate. So they try to add on an intimidation factor to it. And I think this kind of fixes the issues with the kid who burned the cross on the yard. And the court held that while cross burning was protected by the First Amendment, if it's done with the intent to intimidate, it constitutes a true threat and can be banned without violating free speech. This decision actually makes a lot more sense, and it ties it in with the intent aspect. I don't know if somebody's going to do that without the intent to intimidate, but this one actually addressed the issue of conduct, which is slightly beyond speech. There's speech and then there's conduct. And conduct, of course, being the act of intimidation through threats. Now, as I was talking about earlier, there's verbal acts. Because a threat to somebody it's words, it's speech. Everything comes back to speech. You write it down, you say it, it's a threat. So it is between banning offensive ideas, which is unconstitutional, and threatening conduct, speech turned into a verbal act intended to instill fear. So I've got this little chart here, talks about the progress of these laws. And I think, in this particular case, it seems more like it's narrowed down in a way that kind of makes sense. I'm going to keep moving. I got a few slides to go through. I said we had about 90 minutes to 2 hours or whatever to discuss this, and I thought, how am I going to fill that up? So I put too many slides in. Well, the Masterpiece Cake Shop. This is a case, you probably heard about this case. It was the baker in Colorado, Jack Phillips, who declined to create a custom wedding cake for a same-sex couple based on his religious beliefs about marriage. And the couple filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which ruled against Phillips. The conversations before this case came out in 2018 were interesting. I mean, we went back and forth. Everybody's talking about this case who's involved in constitutional law. And the question was, is a cake speech or is a cake simply a cake? Is it like making a tire and refusing to sell somebody a tire for their car because they're going to drive to a gay wedding? And so the idea that and he said, well, I bake my cakes very carefully. I designed them specifically for different people, and I don't want to make a cake because it violates my religious beliefs. The Supreme Court kind of danced around the issue. It didn't say whether or not you have to make the cake in that particular case. The court, and this happens a lot. You'll see the Supreme Court kind of come up with a decision where it doesn't really address the issue head on, but comes up with something enough where it can make a decision and kind of get the thing off their desk. So the court ruled 7-2 in favor of Phillips, but it didn't say he had the right to make the cake. It just said that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission had shown hostility toward his religious beliefs during its own proceedings, violating the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. So the takeaway from this case was not anything to do with the cake, but it was about how the enforcement proceedings took place. And the court said the government needs to be neutral toward religion, because there's some people said, his religion is wrong. They should be loving toward everybody. And Jack Phillips is been, he doesn't have the, he's absolutely just wrong and needs to be overridden because his religious beliefs are no good. I'm kind of paraphrasing there. There's pages and pages of stuff, and you can go back and read the cake shop decision itself. But it basically turned into a speech case and talking about the government's speech in that, not his speech when it came to the cake. There's Fulton versus City of Philadelphia 2021. And this was a case that had to do with a foster care agency in Philadelphia that refused to certify same-sex couples as foster parents due to the church's teachings on marriage. And so the city stopped sending children to CSS and threatened to cancel their contract unless the agency changed its policy. And the court ruled unanimously 9-0 that the city violated the First Amendment free exercise clause by refusing to contract with them unless they agree to certify same-sex couples. The main principle from that is that religious freedom can require exceptions to generally applicable laws when the system already permits discretionary exceptions. So in this case, there were already exceptions to various rules within the way that they refer children. And so they told the city of Philadelphia that they needed to also make an exception for Catholic social services. And it's the idea that religious exercise deserves protection, especially when secular exemptions are already available. There are 303 Creative versus Atlantis. This was a huge case 2 years ago. I don't know if any of you remember this one. This is the web designer who wanted to make wedding websites, but she objected to the Colorado rule that would require her to provide such services or face penalties. Her case was interesting because there actually wasn't a full case in controversy. Nobody got to her to request a website that she disagreed with, but she didn't want to go through the hassle. She said, look, if I refuse, I'm going to be in trouble for it, and I don't want to have to put, a disclaimer on my website, saying I'm going to make websites for everybody. Now, this case I kind of look at this case as sort of a extension of the Baker case, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, because in that case, there is a question over whether or not a cake was free speech. But a website, it's pretty much free speech. It's a piece of artistic work being done for a particular couple to celebrate their particular marriage. It's not a template. They want something special that's just for them. So, whether or not she would have had any customers wanting a same-sex wedding website, the court did take the case. And there's some issues with whether or not the court issues advisory opinions without a controversy in question. But in this case, they actually did it. So if you want to get stuck on that issue, we'll talk about that later. The issue of ripeness for a dispute. But it reinforced a First Amendment principle that the government cannot compel individuals to speak messages that they do not believe. So if you have a business and you have expressive services, forcing creatives to produce content that violates their convictions constitutes unconstitutional compelled speech and extends to all viewpoints, not just religious ones. So if one of the things that we discussed this summer in some of the meetings in Switzerland was the idea that a person who is religious can claim certain privileges and exemptions that a person who is secular cannot. And the 303 case really was more about free speech and not about free exercise of religion. It didn't really matter whether or not she was religious. It just mattered that she had this viewpoint that she did not want to support. So I think the court's going to start looking more into the content of the issue rather than whether or not the person promoting it is religious or not. There's a Kennedy versus Bremerton School District case. I'm kind of giving you a constitutional law background this morning. He was a football coach who would kneel at the 50-yard line after games to have a brief prayer. And sometimes students would join him voluntarily, and the school district ordered him to stop, fearing it violated the Establishment Clause. And eventually they fired him. Now, an interesting thing here is, and this illustrates kind of the tension between the free exercise and the Establishment Clause, is that he says, I have free exercise to do this. And the school's like, if we let you do this, we're going to get sued for promoting religion. And so the courts have to kind of step in and try to figure out how this is going to play out. The reality is the free exercise clause and the establishment clause do exist in tension. They don't, a lot of times when you want to have free exercise, other people are going to say that's violating the establishment clause. And that has to, we can go into the funding cases. They're fortunately they're not in the free exercise or free speech range, but just very briefly to understand the tension, you have the cases where religious schools have requested funding for different things, and the states are saying no, that would violate the Establishment Clause, and the schools are saying we have a religious free exercise right to that money, and sometimes the court has actually been giving them the money, and so to me that's kind of a disconnect, but it does demonstrate that tension that's going on. Anyway, so Joseph Kennedy sued, and the court ruled that his free exercise and free speech rights had been violated, and they overturned the Lemon test and the endorsement test, holding that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by references to historical practices and understanding. Now, if you've followed constitutional law for a period of time, you'll know that the Lemon test is something that people used to talk about all the time, and it had to do with whether or not the government would be seen as endorsing religion. But they've sort of switched away from the Lemon test and they've gone into the endorsement test. They've gone into historical practices and understanding test, which I think is extremely weak. That is basically saying, well, as long as they did it a long time, then it's enough to kind of say, well, he gets to he gets to have his prayer in the middle of the field. And frankly, I don't know why, unless he's like Daniel praying every morning because, before we know it is against the law, unless it's like that, I don't know what the compulsion was. But it's a big issue. I see there are a couple questions here, and maybe we can address a couple of them if they want to ask them now.
No, we're just getting lined up. They're just lining up.
Yeah,
and
we're just getting ready for you to finish.
This is getting intimidating.
No, but there's no rush. There's no rush, Michael.
Okay, no problem.
We're very engaged. Please go ahead.
I was just saying, and I, if there's something that, I can't see the messages that are going back and forth. So if anybody puts anything in there they want to really jump in on, I'd be happy to address it. That's no problem at all.
Well, you mentioned you mentioned Daniel and his friends praying, and here's one that I found very interesting. Is when Dan Patrick, the head of the Religious Liberty Commission and Lieutenant Government for Texas, he offered a prayer in the Senate gallery, and some people didn't stand. And he said, if you don't stand, you're going to be removed. And I thought that was pretty fascinating when you compare it to Daniel. Those who don't bow down and kneel are going to be prosecuted for what they did. I don't know if you have time to mention that, but I found that
Well,
rather.
actually, yeah, actually, I'd like to touch on that. That just happened this year, right?
It was recently.
Yeah, that was this recently, and it's funny because I don't know. I've never been a huge fan of public prayer. I mean, maybe that's heretical, but it's because usually, unless somebody's just kind of doing a bless everybody kind of prayer, I've heard so many where people are like, "Oh, now's my chance to preach a sermon in my prayer," and they're like, "I'm right and you're wrong," and everybody's bowing their head as if they have to agree to it and respect whatever the person's saying. And I don't know. Um, it's kind of doesn't mean I'm against prayer. I'm all in favor of prayer, and I'm all in favor of pastors being able to say whatever they want. But when you in the government position and you're in there just kind of pounding people over the head with your prayer, um, it just comes off as it just seems weird and unnecessary.
It struck me as uh, performative rather than truly spiritual, and especially when you finish and say, if you didn't stand up next time, we're going to take you out of here. We're going to haul you out of here.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other concept, I forgot what her name was, the pastor who gave a sermon right after Trump's inauguration. And
Was it Paula White?
I don't know if it was Paula White or if she was at a church that they went to out for a service.
Hmm.
Like
Can't,
I forgot what her name was. But anyway, she gave a speech or a sermon and she criticized Trump.
Mhm.
And
oh, that was the bishop of the Washington National Cathedral. Yeah.
yeah, that was it. And so he's like, "Well, you can't criticize me in your sermon." And we have this guy right after that in Texas saying, "You better respect my prayer that I'm going to pray, and I'm going to tell you what I think in my prayer."
Yeah.
It see, religion is I don't know if you played video games, but a lot of times like Mario Kart or whatever, you get a power up. You drive. I play with my son all the time. You drive through those little question mark blocks, and you go really fast because you get a magic mushroom or something. And religion is kind of like that for politics. If you need a little bit of turbo boost, you kind of get a little bit of divine endorsement of what you're doing, and you can fly because nobody can stop you. As soon as you say, if somebody, God wants me to do such and such, and so anybody disagrees, you say, you know, God doesn't appreciate you disagreeing with my prayer here that I've given here in front of you at the government office or the parliament or whatever,
Yeah.
Congress.
It does.
But
It does juice your message just a little bit,
yeah.
doesn't it?
So anyway, if anybody else wants to jump in, let me know and
By
we'll
the way, that happened in August, so it was just a couple
August.
months ago.
Okay. I don't think I wrote about that one in our blog, but you know, I, I know I thought about it. Now I'm going to talk about some of the perspectives on free speech because there are different sides on this. And my goal today is not to give a political perspective. Uh, but rather sort of approach this from a bird's eye perspective. So concerns from the left on free speech and religious liberty are that hate speech causes real harm. We talked about the verbal acts. Um, there's an argument that speech targeting marginalized communities based on race, religion, gender, etc., inflicts dignitary harm and creates hostile environments. Words can wound, silence vulnerable voices, and perpetuate systemic inequality. You'll hear the word dignitary harm a lot. And this has been it's a phrase kind of risen in the last few years. And that's the idea that if you say something that somebody doesn't like, you are not only speaking something that they don't like, but you're actually offending their human rights and human dignity. They also look at religious liberty as a shield for discrimination. And there's a concern that religious freedom claims are weaponized to circumvent anti-discrimination laws, particularly regarding LGBTQ plus rights. And there's fear that expansive religious exemptions undermine equal protection and access to public accommodations. This is a, and I think that can be a legitimate concern in a number of different angles. A lot of people, when you hear religious liberty, it's sort of like the prayer that Lauren was talking about, where you pretty much say, look, it's my religious liberty, end of discussion. I saw this come up a lot when it came with these vaccine rules. And a lot of people said, well, I have I don't want the vaccine. And they said, well, how do you avoid the vaccine? They read the form and there's a little box that said, well, check this if you have a religious exception. And they said, oh, I have a religious exception to it. I have an objection to it. And so they checked the box, and then they argued that there's a religious reason. And after they checked the box, they tried to come up with a religious reason to avoid the vaccine. And I saw some of the arguments. A lot of people said, well, these are some people actually thought that the vaccine was constructed of the fetal cells of aborted infants, when in reality, these are strains that have existed since the 1970s and have been used to help create medications from Pepto-Bismol to Tylenol to whatever else. So, people with medicine cabinets full of stuff that is using the same cell line would object to the vaccine on those lines. I'm not, going to get too deep into that issue, but I want to talk about how religious liberty can be used as a shield for that sometimes. And then they would want to balance, they said, individual liberty has to be balanced with collective dignity and equality. And when speech or religious exercise harms others' abilities to participate fully in society, government has a legitimate interest in protecting the vulnerable. This is something that, sort of like the European argument in the UK on freedom of speech. We see that a lot there. We've also seen some of it in Canada. Don't see it too much in the United States. But this idea that if you're going to say something that affects other people, you can actually physically harm them. So that's kind of the progressive perspective. There are other things beyond this. Then there's a conservative perspective. And conservatives argue that progressive institutions, like universities, corporations, and media, will engage in silencing traditional or religious perspective. Cancel culture threatens open debate by imposing social and professional penalties for dissenting views. So it's sort of a counter to the prior slide, the third point there. They also argue that religious believers are being marginalized. They're the ones who are no longer the majority and are being marginalized by a secular society. And religious liberty is a fundamental right that cannot be subordinated to other social movements or anti-discrimination mandates. And I think there's a genuine fear in some people that their religious freedom is being taken away. I know that's something we've had to contend with, and sort of in the Adventist circles, is the idea that people don't look at religious freedom as a static right, but that it's constantly under threat and needs to be constantly argued for. My perspective on religious freedom, and this is going to sound possibly unusual for somebody who's kind of focused on this issue, is that religious freedom is a supporting ministry for the church. It should not be the centerpiece of Adventism, in the sense that there's been this desire by some to always lead out in evangelism by saying, we're under attack from so-and-so, and we're being pushed back by so-and-so. And religious freedom sort of takes on a central focus when the focus should be Christ. Religious freedom, I mean, it's really sort of like a fire extinguisher that you keep charged up but under glass. And when an emergency happens, you pull it out and you hit it. You don't constantly go around arguing that your freedom is being taken away when it's not. And there's been sort of a cottage industry within Adventism and also within the larger evangelical world to argue that religious freedom is a is constantly under attack and having to constantly expand that into areas where freedom wasn't originally going. So to have to roll back the, the school prayer laws from the 1950s, 1960s. They want to get government funding of religion. And anytime any of those things fail, they say that there's activist judges working against their interest. Um, and, in a sense, we kind of see it in the church. And I get it. I mean, there are a lot of people who view a degradation of religious freedom as a prerequisite for the second coming. So they'd say, well, Jesus is not going to come unless the Pope does his thing and makes the Sunday law. So we need to sort of oppose the Sunday law, but we also need to kind of be happy that it comes because we know that that's what is necessary for Jesus to come. And it becomes this huge oddball argument. And this is, there may be some people who don't like this, but I don't think God's calendar is dependent on who the Pope is or is dependent on being persecuted. Jesus only gave one prerequisite for his second coming. So one thing needs to be done, and that is to spread the gospel, the Great Commission. That is what needs to be completed, and then the end will come. He doesn't say, that's going to happen, and then you're going to have this other stuff go on. And I believe we're going to have persecution. I think the Bible is very clear about that. But to live in the today and now as if you're constantly, under some kind of a death threat from other people who are also Christians, whose songs you sing every week, just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's something that we need to really focus on moving beyond, I think. Make friends rather than build fortresses is kind of what I'm trying to do. And it's one of the themes of what we've done with Founders First Freedom and sponsoring these conferences and things, is to build bridges and make friendships rather than build fortresses. So anytime somebody says, oh, you shouldn't talk to so-and-so because they disagree with you about this, or you shouldn't, engage in conversation in certain places where people are going to disagree with you. The reality is, those kind of things, if you go in there with the right attitude, you go in there making friends, it's absolutely key. Anyway, that's my sermon for the day. The other thing the conservatives are concerned about are government compulsion and conscience. And that is the emphasis that government cannot compel speech or violate conscience. Forcing individuals to affirm messages they reject, whether through compelled speech or coerced participation, represents a dangerous expansion of state power incompatible with liberty. That would be like the wedding cases, the cake shop and the website designer, things like that. If the government's forcing people to act against their religious beliefs, they're very concerned about that. And I think there's a reason for that. I think some of these are they can be legitimate arguments and reasons why there are concerns. So common ground. I guess I started talking about this when I showed the last slide. Despite deep disagreements, left and right share fundamental commitments that can serve as a foundation for constructive dialogue. I tried to find pictures of politicians who would let you see beyond the current politics. So I figured Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford are far enough back to sort of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So here's kind of like what I see going forward and trying to come to a common agreement. I think affirming human dignity is important. Now, these are things, and I've talked a lot about what the government says about like burning crosses, that type of stuff. But when it comes down to it, how do we move past that? We're not going to hopefully be the ones on the extremes of these issues actually making the case law. And hopefully the case law stays far away from the stuff that we routinely engage in as Christians. But these can be a foundation for constructive dialogue. Human dignity. Both sides affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, though they may disagree on how best to protect it. Opposition to government censorship. Across the spectrum, there is skepticism of government as the arbiter of acceptable speech. I think we also need to, speak in objection to government censorship on both sides of the issue. Democratic discourse. Both progressives and conservatives believe in the importance of open debate for a functioning democracy. There are a lot of times where people have spoken up and then they get shouted down, they're unable to talk. And to me, both sides need to at least allow other people to speak, even if they don't attend or listen to what they're saying. They're able to at least have that conversation and be out there in the stream of ideas. Don't shut people down. Don't suppress the speech. And protection of conscience. I think in order to move forward, you got to have a broad agreement that individuals should not be forced to violate deeply held beliefs. The scope of this, of how broad this is, can be contested, but generally, sometimes there may be, because there are conflicts and there are sincere disagreements on things. Let the financial marketplace handle some of these issues when it comes to the baker and to the web designer. If you disagree with it, they may feel a business pinch from it. But at least those people can say they were able to protect their conscience. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them or disagree with them. Now, this is a quote I hesitated putting in here because it is so circular. I got to actually move my monitor here so I can see it. Okay, so the paradox of tolerance. I'm going to read this to you. You can copy and paste it for later. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and the tolerance with them. So do you want to, you may need to diagram that out. But what it says is that if a society is committed to tolerance, you may end up tolerating people who are not tolerant, and then they take over and their intolerance becomes the de facto right. And this is something we've seen happen in different societies where you say, look, we're going to let you speak, and if you're intolerant, you have the right to talk about how intolerant you are, and we're going to give you a platform. And then eventually they take over, and then there's no longer any tolerance for you or for them, for people who disagree with them. And so how do you protect openness without enabling its demise? How do you take tolerance and handle it appropriately? Now, the constitutional law rejects that kind of a paradox. And in America, and this is, not every country in the world is like this, but we sort of have traditionally championed more speech, not enforced silence, as a remedy for bad ideas. The First Amendment protects even intolerant viewpoints and relies on counter speech, so people speaking against the bad ideas, and democratic resilience, people voting against people who have bad ideas, rather than government censorship. So the idea is, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but you're kind of marginalized because you're crazy. Of course, we talked about the beginning. We've given a platform to insane ideas who get all the oxygen in the room. And in the age of the internet, it's much harder to actually counteract bad ideas because it's on so many sources and so many different places. And so that's the thing that we're going to have to tackle going forward as a society is how do we promote free speech, but still give room for bad ideas? And how do we counteract the bad ideas with good ideas?
Michael, just keeping an eye on the time here, maybe time to move for some of these many hands that we have up.
Okay, sure. Okay, let me just I'll skip through here. One of the things I talked about here very briefly was the idea of computer code being speech. In the old days it would be completely bizarre to consider that computer code was speech, but now the question becomes whether AI, artificial intelligence, is speech. That can actually be its own subject sometime. I think AI is going to become it's going to take over the world. in terms of the way people communicate. And then just very briefly, we've talked about these, in passing. Battlegrounds where free speech is battles are taking place are social media platforms, college campuses, workplaces, and public accommodations. Those are kind of arenas where we're going to see these kind of issues. Um, and so the path forward, default to freedom, protect all perspectives equally, regardless of popularity, um, promote counter speech over censorship, and respect deeply held beliefs, even if you don't agree with them. And and here's sort of a framework of what we talked about. There's legal precedents, um, sort of understanding where we've come, why the law is the way it is, space for conscience. What rights do you have within the American constitutional framework, and how do you promote respectful dialogue? Again, here's another plug for the website, um, religiouslibertytv.substack.com. I would encourage you to subscribe. Just do it for free if you'd like. It's not, you don't have to pay for it. And be on our newsletters. I think we sent out one this morning as well. So anyway, let's get to some questions.
Okay, good. But before we jump into that, Lauren, would you like to say a word about next week?
I do. I just want to let you know that we have one of my favorite teachers coming next week, Olive Hemmings. Uh, Olive, I mentioned earlier that Olive has really shaped my thinking in terms of righteousness and justice and how they go together in the Old Testament. Olive, do you want to say anything more about that? If you're tuned in, I see you here. Anyway, I think she's going to talk next week about this is kind of interesting because I've read just a little bit of Renee Girard, and I think she's going to talk about scapegoatism, if I'm not mistaken. If she picks up here, we'll have her talk. But that's all I wanted to say. So go on to Linda, who has been waiting patiently.
Yeah, Linda, I'm going to ask you to unmute. And if you would like to do that, there you go.
Hi,
You're
can you
set.
hear me?
Yes, we can. Go
Can you
ahead
hear
and ask
me?
your. Yes, we can. Go ahead and ask your question, Linda.
Okay, when sunset comes today, I'll be entering another chapter. Um, I'll have a birthday, and I want to share this. I can remember when I was a child sitting on my grandmother's porch. She lived in the country. In the afternoon, people would come by and sit on her porch with her. My aunts would serve freshly brewed coffee in real china cups. The conversation would wax and wane on different topics. As I look back, and I'm reflecting back because I said another chapter starts at sunset. As I look back on these times, I can I can see, I can realize that there was no arguments, regardless of the subjects discussed. I came to realize as I grew older that this daily afternoon gathering was more about having a space where they, on my grandmother's porch, that they could discuss things, that they were welcome, that they felt like they belonged, and that they didn't have to stay away because of difference of opinion. And this just was as a young child. This relates to this conversation that we're having, and I thank you, Dr. Peabody. That was an excellent presentation. This relates to this space of of Adventist Today's Sabbath seminar, and that I have had, excuse me, I have had disagreements with people on this forum since I came. I think it's probably about a year ago, but I have always felt welcome here. I have never felt like I was disrespected, and my personal opinions have meant less to the group than that they made me feel welcome. And that's why I come back every week, the warmth and the welcome. I fell in I feel in this space. I wanted to thank Lauren and the people of this space, everybody, and you know who you are, you come regular, and holding this space for me. Because sometimes I've had some disagreements with the Lord, especially when I first started. Well, but I feel like that I belong. And by allowing me this free speech without denigrating me has made me open to listen to others' point of view on this forum and to realize that the love in this group outweighs our differences. So on the eve of my next chapter, which I will be 75 years old tomorrow, or well, at sunset today, I want to thank Lauren and the group for making me feel welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. We appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thanks, Linda, for that. It really kind of gives us a big, broad brush approach to what this is about. And before I go on to George, Michael, would you take down your backdrop so that we can go back to the regular screen? Would you mind, please? Some
Okay,
have asked.
sure. If I can figure this out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Got it.
Thank you. That's
I went
terrific.
ahead and did it, Michael. It's done.
Okay, it's still showing my back screen, or is it?
No, it's
No,
gone.
you're
It's out
perfect.
now?
You're perfect.
Okay,
It's
perfect.
great.
It's
Okay.
gone.
So George, just before I come to you, real quick, I want to ask Michael a question. This is just teensy bit off topic, but I wonder, Michael, if you have a brief update, if you know, about the circumstance that I think you wrote a couple of times about, where the pastor had gotten himself in trouble for kicking board members off the campus because they cooperated with law enforcement regarding a case having to do with someone who might be a sexual offender. Is there any update to that case? Did you not write about it a couple of times?
Yeah, I wrote a couple times. I don't have an update on that, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. I just would ask.
Robert Wagley in the Gulf States Conference, if you want to look it up. But last time I talked to his conference president, Michael, he just said he went home again, obviously, and there hasn't been anything until a court date is set.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. So George, I come to you. Please weigh in. What's your thought, your question today?
Thank you, Michael, for this great presentation. You focused on a set of rules and laws that are have been status quo for a long time, or normal times. My concern now is that we are not living in normal times anymore. The country is going through a really difficult time in time of changes. So my concern is that this country looks like a house of cards that is crumbling down. Do you have any comment about free speech in times of difficulty, or even in times of martial law? Because I have the intuition that we are heading to that. At the end of the day, we will be under martial law. Now we have a fascist government already, but it's not enough for them. What's going to happen? Are there any lessons from the past century about it, when a government became, authoritarian, fascist, and other modalities? What happened to the First Amendment? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Of course, our nation started out, with people disagreeing with the way the government was run and having a revolutionary war in the 1770s. We went through the Civil War. And of course, before the Civil War, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. The First Amendment didn't apply to the states until after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Then after that, we went through the conscription issue that we talked about with the Schenck case. We went through the civil rights movement. We went through the Vietnam protests. All those were identified in the case law that we've had in the United States. All those arose during times of tremendous stress. So we have, are you getting some feedback? Okay. Anyway, so we've been through stressful times before. And the question is whether or not to say, look, our Constitution, our rights are not big enough to handle what we're currently going through, so we need to restrict those rights. Or can we maintain those continued rights going forward? There was some stress during 2020, during COVID, when the government started taking some attempts to censor speech. They said, oh, don't talk about anything that calls vaccines into question. And that quickly expanded to not talking about the Hunter Biden laptop. And the government went to social media companies and told them to censor that kind of speech that the government didn't like. And now that we have the Trump administration in place, it seems like the Trump administration was going to places saying, look, we need to block off the speech that we don't like. And so as this back and forth happens with increasing frequency, within the course of 4 years, of kind of a whiplash effect, I am afraid that as we go forward, we're going to see more and more of that whiplash effect happening, and you're going to have more and more censorship. Historically, the United States switches administrations every, 4 to 12 years. There'll be a complete change and other people will be in power. And whatever restrictions happen during one administration usually are expanded upon in the next, because they say, oh, you did it, now I'm going to do it to you. And then they say, well, you did it, I'm going to do it to you. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And so my concern would be that the frequency to which these changes are happening needs to be rolled back, and it needs to be less bombastic, and more, more balanced out, with a recognition by both sides, hopefully bringing sides together in a discussion saying, look, we have to stop this. We need to have a measured discussion, because you're not always going to be in office. We're going to be in office in a couple of years. And so you want to make sure you respect us. Democracy has handled our disputes in the past. The courts have sort of issued a protection for it, but I think we need to really, focus on expanding these rights, making sure that the constitutional rights are protected, and not rolling them back during a time of stress.
Thank you. Ray and Bobby, what's on your mind?
Well, again, Colorado is in the forefront of the Supreme Court, with the latest one being about Colorado's law banning conversion therapy. And it's being argued, or going to be argued, by a person or persons, that this is restricting their freedom of speech. Licensed therapists, psychologists, and so forth, is said, are countering that and saying this is a medical issue, do no harm type thing. So how do you see this particular case shaping up, or your opinion?
Okay, that's a big case right now, because there's, it's interesting, because the question is whether or not that kind of counseling constitutes a verbal act, is where I would put that analysis. When you are giving, insurance pays for counseling. I don't know if it pays for the that kind of counseling or not, may not, but the idea is that there is a certain tangible benefit to the speech that is being provided by a therapist, and whether or not that therapist is providing a service that is harmful or helpful is an issue that the court has to address. And it has to be, and so it's a kind of a tough issue, because it's not like the person, the counselors are preaching sermons. They're supposed to actually be physically addressing each case by case basis, and trying to change a person's makeup in terms of how they see the world and interact the world. It's kind of like an operating system transplant. So I'm gonna I haven't read the oral arguments on it. I understand the court seems to be kind of leaning toward overturning that, but I didn't read the transcript from it. I think that case was argued on Thursday, and I hadn't really followed the briefs on it. But I think it's a big issue, and it's going to. I want to see what the court. I need to read that before I can give you a good answer.
Okay, second part of the question. Do you think the Supreme Court is changing its ideas on freedom of speech? Is it becoming a little bit more narrow?
Well,
It seems to the American public in everything you read, which may or may not be accurate. So are you seeing a change in how they interpret things versus the past?
it's in one sense it seems like they're more. It has to do with the mixture of cases that the court is deciding to hear. And I think the court is starting to hear a lot of cases having to do with people who were religious, who want to get some kind of a advantage or something because of their religious beliefs. Be able to secure funding, be able to, pray in public. A teacher, a coach at a school wanting to pray in public, that kind of thing. I think that so there are two ways to look at it. In one sense, I think the court is expanding free exercise and free speech in that sense. I think the court is putting things into the free exercise bucket that it didn't before, but at the same time, it's taking things out of the Establishment Clause bucket and putting them into the free exercise bucket. So, for instance, you have the Ten Commandments cases in Texas and Louisiana that are likely going to go up. In the past, the Supreme Court kind of drew a line where it said that the Ten Commandments monument that had been up for many, many years could stand, but a new monument or a new posters could not stand. And the court previously addressed those issues. And now the states of California, Louisiana, and Texas are saying, hey, I think the court may take a different approach to it. So they're passing laws saying we want new posters put up in every classroom, and we want to really take another run at the court and see if it will overturn the Van Orden and the other case from 2005 or 2006 or whatever it was. So I think there's a lot of pressure saying to the court, hey, we want you to change your mind on what you did before. So I know I'm giving you a circular discussion, but I'm kind of thinking through it as we go. And I think you have a very legitimate question. I think it's a very legitimate concern because there are obviously many people who think that the Supreme Court is going to fundamentally change the way it's approached these issues in the past by making another run at it for multiple states. So yes, I think there's going to be some changes. How they play out, I don't know. The court may very well say, look, we are rescinding our prior decision. I think Justice Thomas recently said that there's no such thing as precedent when it comes to anything that could possibly bind us to our past. And
yeah,
so
he did.
that's opened a huge door. So again, you asked me to speculate on the court, but I think, and I think there are reasons for concern.
Thanks, Ray. Patty, we come to you. Good afternoon. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this has been a very timely and informative presentation, and I appreciate what you've done by coming and sharing with us today. We all know the political climate in our country, the US, I'm speaking of, is very strange. It has never been this way in our history, to paraphrase Donald Trump, in the history of all mankind. It's never been like this. And our president said recently that he is all for free speech. Oh, we have great free speech. It's very important to us in the United States. And then the next week he says, well, you better watch out what you say. in social media and in your your communications with other people, because if you say anything negative about me, I'm going to seek you down and come and get you, and you're going to experience retribution for what you have said because you didn't agree with me. So I am just asking, as an average citizen, my social media footprint basically is limited to Facebook and Zoom. But I have a lot of friends on Facebook that put provocative things there, and I respond to some of that. But recently I have been feeling, I guess, a little afraid to come right out and say some of the things I'm thinking. I'm sure that the president and the administration are really talking at this point about more high-profile people saying negative things about him. But I'm just wondering what you think are the possibilities that the average citizen on Facebook says something to have a negative response in our lives. What can we do, if anything? What should we try to do to protect ourselves without being afraid and without being paranoid?
I think that's a really good question. You know, like we talked about earlier, you could become famous while you're if you're on the toilet writing a phone message. You know, people are post a little video. It could be a teacher somewhere. It could be a, you know, some person who works at McDonald's can post something on the internet and become famous. There's no requirement that you have to have been interviewed by a committee of people and been given a job in order to reach millions and millions of people. Everybody is potentially on the hot seat. So I would like to say, you know, we have a robust constitutional protection for speech. But the reality is, there may be, you know, freedom from prosecution, but there are all kinds of ramifications between here and there. And I think we've got to be really careful. One thing I was going to talk about today, and I didn't think I had time to do it, but was like a lot of churches are, and this is something I've talked about in my blog before. They live stream everything. They live stream the Sabbath school class. They live stream the prayer requests. They live stream whatever it is. It goes all over the world. And the reality is, you know, most people aren't going to watch this stuff unless they're looking for something. So if they hear, oh, so-and-so goes to that church, maybe they said something. People will seek that out. You know, everything is searchable by keyword now. If you go to YouTube and you just type in somebody's name at random, you'll find stuff that was said about them. Like I looked up my name once and I found out somebody mentioned my website in their sermon. So I didn't even know that, you know. So it's a very it's one of those things where people are going to get, you know, what you say anywhere in public can potentially come back and bite. And so I would recommend, you know, unless you're willing to commit to something, be careful about that. Right now, and I'm not going to use them as a good example, just to illustrate the way that things could spread. There's the guy running for Attorney General in Virginia who said some pretty heinous things about his, you know, some politician there. But he said that in the message, and the person wrote back to him and said, "Oh, you shouldn't say that kind of thing." And he kept saying he dug in. He's like, "No, I'm going to say this," and it's become public. It could ruin this guy's, you know, career for the rest of his life just because he was not careful with what he said in a private text message that now is public. So,
Well, case in point, look at the 200 plus teachers in Texas who lost their jobs because they said something unfavorable about Charlie Kirk
yeah,
just lately
well, that kind of thing
on their
is
social media,
happening.
on their private social media platforms.
Yeah. So, yeah, social media. I mean, and I know I've said things in the past that are probably gotten me, you know, might be not seen favorably by people. And I don't know. I'd be, if you're nervous about it, don't say it. If you don't want to say it to the whole world, don't say it anywhere. And I wish I could tell you that we have the protection to protect that, but there's not.
Well, Patty, that may not have been the answer you were looking for, but it's better to have clarity.
Well,
Is it?
yeah, I'm glad that he is so serious about this, that it is a serious problem, and we are all potentially exposed.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Patty, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Emmanuel, glad you're here. I can't see you, but join us in the conversation.
Good afternoon. I enjoyed the presentation. I have two questions. Question number one, do you think that free speech is in life support right now? Because even though the Supreme Court say it's okay to burn the flag, last week or the week before, the president said if you burn the flag, you go to jail for 1 year. My second question is, at the beginning of the 1900s, the FBI infiltrated the Adventist church. And now we are going to send over 1 billion copy of the great controversy around the world, and people feel they are being attacked. The question is, what is the line between evangelism and attacking people under the cover of free speech?
That's a big question.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah.
One thing that bothers me, and I see it come up all the time, is you'll have people say, you know, burning a flag should be made illegal and this person should go to jail, and then they may even put a bill in the book somewhere and try to get people to vote on it. A lot of times they don't make it out of committee, but politicians are always trying to appeal to their constituency that might elect them, and they'll say, I put a flag burning, you know, amendment in the Constitution or flag burning bill in the system, and nobody voted for it, but I want to let you know I did that. And every so often those kinds of things get through. And it's kind of like this idea of, you know, people write bills they know are not constitutional and they'll still try to get it done. And I'm always afraid, hey, you know, that's probably not going to pass, but what if it did? Are we going to have to fight a court battle over this? What's going to come up next? So those kind of issues are a concern for me. I look at that and I wonder what's going to happen, you know. So I often follow those. Sometimes I know it's just absolutely not going to go anywhere, but sometimes it does. With the idea of evangelism, I'm not familiar with the FBI and infiltrating the church or anything, so I would defer to the experts in that area.
That's from Kevin Burton, by the way.
Okay.
He's the guy who's done most of the work on that.
And I'd ask Kevin then.
And for those of you who are interested, Kevin's presentation on that to ATSS is on our YouTube page. It's absolutely fascinating. Yes, it was around World War One. The FBI visited the GC and asked, "Are you loyal to the United States because you talk about the overthrow of the United States under the figure of the second beast of Revelation, I believe, if I remember it correctly."
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Johnston, I'm offering you the opportunity to unmute and give your thoughts here for the group.
Yeah, first I want to say, Mr. Peabody, I think your voice is becoming a little bit fainter compared to the others that are speaking, and you may need to turn something up there. I have two questions. I was interested in your conference, I think it was in Switzerland. I have the impression that Adventist religious liberty people hold up the United States Constitution and laws as kind of the gold standard, and not all countries have our First Amendment. I mean, you referred to the UK. How do we argue in other countries that don't have our Constitution? My second question is the lawfulness of a speech act determined by its intention or its consequences? On January 6th, I guess our president on the Oval, addressed a pretty good crowd of people and said to them, go and fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you won't have a country. And later on, he and his supporters said that he meant a peaceful demonstration, but his audience at the time apparently didn't understand it that way. So my question is, what makes a speech act lawful or unlawful? Its intention, or its professed intention, or its consequences? Those are two questions.
I think that the second, can you hear me better now? Turn myself up a little
Yes.
bit.
Yes,
I have
thank
this
you.
focus right here, and I can adjust it here. Is that better?
Much better.
Okay, good. I think a few minutes ago I was talking about something and I said, hey, it's better to address it ahead of time than fight it in court. And so I used the word fight, right? Um, and I wasn't thinking, oh, I want to go beat up somebody in court for it. I was saying, litigate over it. The word fight is a very, it can mean a lot of different things. I mean, we fight for freedom doesn't mean you go and you hit somebody with a stick. But, at the other hand, if it looked like there was he was telling people, look, imminently go in there, burn the Capitol down, raid the Capitol building, do these things. That could be considered a incendiary act, but it really depends on, for him, it would be sort of the intention. I think the court would look at the intention of what he did, because you can't guarantee what a crazy person is going to do with what you say. And that's why I
Okay.
always start out my talk with saying, look, I'm not your lawyer. I'm not your, go talk to the lawyer if you need help, because I don't want somebody to run off with something I said during a presentation, completely unaware of what they're thinking. I don't want them to act on that.
So
And
intention is the answer.
the
Thank
intention
you.
will be the answer. And the
Okay.
first question you had was about, what was it about?
Do our religious liberty people, how do they plead in countries that don't have our First Amendment, for example? It sounds to me when I hear religious liberty presentations, they're constantly referring to our Constitution and things like that. And in other countries, and I've lived in other countries, they don't have, for example, our First Amendment. So
Okay.
how do we plead, and what do we plead for in countries that have a different constitution than we do?
Well, that's a really good question also. One of the things that was interesting in our discussions there was that they don't have the same concept of separation of church and state. They kind of look at church as something that has to be managed along with the state.
Hmm.
And, they've routinely, there's no, it's a very different approach to it. The United States is kind of unique in that it does not say that it derives its rights from any human being or any organization or of government. It's a right given to you by God, which is a concept that I think even atheists can appreciate, simply because it's saying there's not somebody above you who has the power over your rights. Uh, and in Europe and other places in the world, they look at rights as much more derivative, like the government will grant these rights for you to be able to speak, and it won't interfere with them. But if you become dangerous, or if you become, use it irresponsibly, we can take those rights away. Um, so it's kind of a matter of perspective. Practically speaking, there's quite a bit of ongoing human rights, but there are also more. It's viewed kind of the opposite way in terms of how you got those rights and how you maintain those rights. If that makes any sense.
Thank you. Good questions. Um, Let me come to Eduardo. Eduardo, it's your turn to speak. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. There is nothing more powerful than the word. Not even the nuclear weapons are so powerful than the word. I read recently the last article of the Sentinel, 1904, and the first page said, freedom of speech or freedom of conscience is only for Romanism. And you can see today that the bishops, American Catholic bishops, they are waving the flag of religious freedom. And I think this flag of religious liberty is only for them. This is my opinion. We see Martin Luther and Paul and many others that they speak the word or the truth and they destroy kingdoms. They take away kingdoms and they take away false religions. So I think that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is a chance to demonstrate that we should not suppress freedom of speech. I don't know about the suppressing freedom of speech because we cannot cry in the stadium fire because a lot of people are gonna die because the stampede. So I think that we should not repress even that one. If somebody has the courage to cry fire in a crowded place and people die, he has to pay the consequences instead of suppressing freedom of speech. What do you think?
Well, let's let Michael react to that, Eduardo. Michael, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, in the Scheck case, they talked about it was kind of in one of the notes about the idea of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And the Brandenburg rule is that you cannot say something that will immediately incite immediate harm. Or, so there's a standard for that, because everything can be called, if I disagree with anything somebody says, I can say, they've offended me and we're going to, react to that very strongly. And it can be called, it could fall under that category of crying, fire in a theater. That's a very narrow exception in the law. But yeah, I think the idea of freedom of speech, and it's kind of an aspect of Christian nationalism, is that there is one God and one truth and one reality in the world. And if you speak against that one reality, then you're flat out lying about it. And therefore you should not be able to. And so there is a need to respect the diversity of viewpoints, even though you may disagree with it. And even and freedom of speech is actually the right to be wrong. Like I can say something that's completely wrong and not have to fear consequence of it. There are of course restrictions, or you can't lie to somebody to get them to buy a product. I can't sell you a car and say, hey, my car has, can go 500 miles an hour and it can barely go 5 miles an hour. I can't commit fraud on you. So there are restrictions on it, but most of them have to do with how they translate into the physical world, not just on ideas that remain in the mind or in the world of words.
I felt like the case law examples that you gave us were really illustrative, illuminating in that regard. It helped me understand some of the nuances with much more clarity than I had, I think, before. Ed, let me come to you. Welcome. Glad to see you today.
Thank you. Michael, thank you for all the good information. I want to ask you to step halfway out of your legal zone into a political legal zone.
Dangerous.
I know. The analysis that you've presented to us today and the rationale for the precedents that have set by the Supreme Court kind of assume a steady state going forward. And in these times, that might be in question. We know that there have been multiple occasions when our president has skirted pretty close to ignoring law. And I think this is just personal speculation, but I think there probably is a struggle in his mind between what is a law of the land and what is his personal objective, and how does he get there? How do you assess the risks that all the precedents, not only on this matter, but any other legal matter, might just be so much ink on paper? If we have a government that chooses to ignore it all, what is that risk? Is it insignificant, significant? I'm just interested in your perspective because you think about these matters.
Yeah, let me give you a really boring story. About 10 years ago, I was elected to be on my HOA. And I don't know if you've ever been on a homeowners association before.
I
And
am right now.
And I wasn't too excited about it. I was just kind of like, yeah, whatever. I mean, I'll do it. Okay, so we had the situation involving parking spaces that could be open to anybody. And this one lady who lived there wanted to take over the parking space and just use it because she said, nobody's parking there every day. I should be able to park my car there. But we were bound by the CC&Rs and said, no, it's for visitors only. And so she ran for the board against me. And because she said, you guys are doing nothing because we keep asking to be able to use these spaces and you keep telling us we can't. I mean, it may relate to your experience on the HOA, I don't know. But anyhow, so she beat me in the election. And I went home, I was happy. So I was like, oh, I don't have to do this anymore because it's kind of a burden, you know. And so I was like, good, I'm off this board, and next, 2 weeks later, I get a call from the management company saying, hey, she resigned because she can't do what she wants to do on the board, and we want to reappoint you to the spot. So I ended up back on the spot again, okay? The bottom line being, there are rules that cannot be changed that are in the CC&Rs. There are rules that cannot be changed that are in the Constitution and in the court precedent, and it is expressed and carried out by the administration. Problem is, if you can't depend on the court to consistently hold what you think the rules are supposed to be, and you have a president who wants to modify the rules and do whatever they want, then you have a situation in which the Constitution doesn't matter. Those rules that are in place they're not beholden to it. There's nobody standing back and saying, oh, you are stuck by these. Somebody once explained that the court does not have an army. The court has nothing. It's just the judges there who write an opinion on a piece of paper. And they hand that over to the parties and say, okay, here's what we think. And the parties, because they have a sense of how the courts are supposed to work, will say, okay, I'm going to follow this ruling. Okay. It's not like, you're even going to get contempt of court proceedings if they don't follow it. There's nothing. There's nobody who carries that stuff out. So when you have a situation where you have a person who's in power, who ignores what the courts say, ignore the Constitution, you end up with what's called a constitutional crisis, because suddenly the Constitution is no longer the parameter within which somebody operates. It's sort of like the idea of jury nullification. Have you heard of that before? That's where a jury will hear a case and they will say, here's what the law is. The judge will say, here's what the law is, make a decision based on what the law says, yes or no, or guilty or not guilty, whatever. And the jury says, well, we looked at the situation and we're here in our jury room, we're by ourselves, nobody's going to pay attention to what we're saying in here. But I really think that this other party should win, even though they were wrong because of XYZ reasons. And so the court will, they'll come out there, say their verdict, and the case is done. And the entire time, the rulings were made outside of the court's jurisdiction, outside the court rules or the law. And that's called a constitutional crisis. Now, what happens in a constitutional crisis? I'm zooming back out again to your larger question. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what will happen. There, I mean, you can have a situation where the court says, it gets to the court says, hey, you didn't follow what we wanted. We wanted this. And like when you're telling your kid, hey, I have kids, okay, and they like to play lawyer. And so any kind of restriction I give them on anything, they narrow it down to the narrowest possible thing. Trying to think what it is, like, oh, can I have this M&Ms? No, you can't have M&Ms. Okay. And then you see them eating a Hershey bar, right? So it's kind of like right now I feel that's where we're at with the court. I think, I've seen some of the decisions coming down recently, and I see that the administration is very narrowly interpreting what was said, not the principle behind it, in order to try to get around it. And eventually then the court has to say, no, all chocolate bars are out. And who says, okay, well, can I have a Jolly Rancher? And it goes on and on like that. Now, I don't know who likes Jolly Ranchers or who buys them. I don't know where they come from. They just kind of show up. I've never bought a Jolly Rancher in my life, but I've ended up with a few of them. But anyhow, that's on the side. Um, but the reality is, we're dealing with a situation that's going to end up going outside the courts, outside it's going to get broader and broader and broader until it's meaningless. If that makes any.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead, Linda, and take the last word here.
Sure.
The first thing I'm going to say is I've got Olive Hemmings coming next week. Olive, do you want to say a word about what you're going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, I'm going to look at the whole concept of scapegoating and redemption, the scapegoat and the redeemer. I'd like to compare Rene Girard's, if you pronounce that, view of scapegoating and the Jungian view of scapegoating. Look and see what kind of scapegoating are we working with in current American society. Is it the redeemer scapegoat? Or is it the scapegoat of envy and
Yeah.
wanting to have what others have? And I want to see how the main expression of Christianity seems to have sidestepped the Redeemer scapegoat for the emetic, as we call it, scapegoat, that the one of envy, jealousy, and revenge.
Yeah. But let me thank you, Olive. I'm really looking forward to that. Have read just enough Rene Girard to be very interested in the whole concept, so that'll be fun. Let me finish up with a couple of quick questions here, Michael. When I was young, well, not that young, when I first came to Ohio about 20 years ago, some organization from Florida, I think it was, took out a full-page ad in the Columbus Dispatch. The great controversy concept, but distilled down to all of its most objectionable features. They
All the nut jobs are in Florida.
yeah. Well, yeah, you would know. But just everything about the Catholics are going to do this, they're going to be persecuting, they're going to put us, just all of this nonsense. So I got a call on the phone from the dispatch. First of all, they're very embarrassed that their person accepted this ad and they're apologizing for it publicly, but they decided to do an article and they wanted something from the Adventist pastor. The Adventist pastor, which was me, that they called, said, it's nonsense. I don't like this approach to the coming of Jesus. I preach that Jesus is coming again. We don't know when, and that's all the end of it. So I get my tail in a clamp because church members are calling me and saying, why did you deny the truth of the great controversy publicly in the paper. Well, the other guy that got quoted in this article, follow-up article, was a Roman Catholic priest who said, "I found this hateful. I think this is inflammatory and defamatory speech against Roman Catholics, which has been going on for a long time. But do you think the Seventh Adventists would know better by now?" And I wondered, did he have a point? Did he have a point in saying that this was hateful speech toward us? Now, I'm going to go ahead and ask my second question right away, Michael, and that is kind of similar in a way. I know a congregation that has made anti-vaccinationism their gospel. They stand in the pulpit and they talk about it constantly. And one of my friends who's in this congregation said, yeah, there's a bunch of old people who died because the pastor convinced them that it was a sin to not depend on your own God-given immune system. And so they wouldn't take the vaccination and they died unnecessarily, according to him. Again, could we be held responsible for hate speech against the Roman Catholics? Could the pastors be held responsible for talking anti-vaccinationism? Some child says, my dad went to your church and he was convinced he didn't have to take a vaccination. He died because of what you said.
I think those are good questions. And the first question, I don't think it would count as hate speech under the law. It wouldn't be illegal. I think it's a bad idea. I think the newspaper that ran the idea probably could say, hey, we're not going to run that without being sued. Although some people say, well, it's our right to tell people that they're wrong.
That's right.
And you're violating our rights. And it's an issue. I mean, there are a lot of people who build their faith on this negative concept, and it, it's kind of like poking a I'm not gonna say poking a tiger. It's just kind of like getting yourself in trouble and then wondering what happened.
Yeah.
I don't think we're, right now, I don't think we're a blip on the radar. But that's just my take on it. It's not one of those things I've chosen to focus on with this website, even though we talk about religious liberty, and I get concepts, people sending me stuff all the time, like, oh,
sure,
why don't you talk about that more? And I just, I don't
think anybody's reading that far into those free grade controversies to find out how anti-Catholic it actually is. So it's really not an issue out there. But in this case, because it was a full page, very splashy ad with popes and in miters and everything, it became an issue in the city.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I think, I think it would fall in that category. Whether or not it's legal or not, it's a different issue. And I know, I kind of know the organization. But yeah, if you go to Google and you type in the word Florida man and you look up news articles, you'll find all kinds of interesting stuff. It's the world's worst superhero.
What about standing in the pulpit and talking to people about not taking vaccinations?
That issue was a huge issue. And I don't know if I've had more people angry at me about anything else than what I wrote about that, because I said, look, I argued on one hand, I said churches should meet. They should have the ability to meet during COVID, but meet safely. Because the second you say a church isn't as essential as something else, you lose your moral authority to, have church in a sense. And I have kids and I got to tell them, hey, we got to go to church. And then, that's not always the easiest conversation. And say, hey, I don't think it's essential. That's one thing. But I said, look, have your vaccines, stand 6 feet apart, wear a mask, whatever it takes, be safe, do it outside, whatever. Just don't blow it off.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, I know several people who died from it. I had one guy called me up and he asked me all this legal advice. He said, well, I want to avoid the vaccine. I don't want to take the vaccine because of XYZ reasons, and it violates my religious freedom. And I said, look, actually, he wanted to give advice to somebody else who didn't want to take it. And he wasn't doing it himself either. And I talked to him and I said, look, there's a risk here. And, I'm going based on what I knew at the time, right? And the guy died of COVID who talked to me. And it was, I felt so bad. A nice guy, a friend of his, but he died, and his whole time, last my conversation I had with him was him yelling. I mean, not yelling at me, but arguing with me about why I was wrong on that subject.
Yeah.
I don't know if the vaccine was saved him or not. I'm not going to get into that, but there's a responsibility level that the church needs to take on when it comes to these kinds of things. It needs to have intestinal fortitude and be able to handle the issue. And I know that there's a lot of argument against this, and some of my best friends are on the opposite side of that issue. And I lost several subscribers over what I said on that.